Hi, it's Taylor T. Carlson. I'm back with another video for you. It doesn't take much to realize that I love Star Wars. Pretty much all this stuff in the background here tells you what you need to know there. I'm going to start doing a new segment today because with the new Star Wars canon, there have been multiple versions of the same story, and when Disney acquired Lucasfilm, they laid down the law and said that everything released would be canon. So we would actually have multiple canon versions of the same story. I'm planning on doing this with all of the films that have been released since Disney bought Lucasfilm and took over. So we're going to start today with The Force Awakens, which was the soft reboot, Episode 7, which pretty much relaunched the Star Wars franchise after a long period of dormancy. So we're going to be looking at 3 versions of this story today. And as with most of my reviews, features, flashbacks, and so forth, there will be spoilers here, so if you have not experienced The Force Awakens in any shape or form, I would come back and watch this video after that. We're going to be looking at the film, of course. This just came out on 4K, so I had to pick that up as soon as it came out. We're also going to be looking at the Marvel comic adaptation and the novel. Now, I'm sure there are other versions of this story as well. There's most likely a comic adaptation from IDW and a junior novelization as well. I believe most of the Disney movies have those as well. I haven't experienced any of those, but if I do read them, I will add my opinions to those in a future video. But for now, we're just going to stick with the film, the Marvel comic adaptation, and the novel. I'm not going to get too into the plot specifics of The Force Awakens because by this point, if you're at all a Star Wars fan, you've almost certainly seen the film. It, of course, revolves around a new generation of heroes as well as several old favorites as well. And the movie, it could have been the thing to make or break the Star Wars franchise coming back, but luckily the movie received a lot of great reviews and was a huge success. It's been followed up by 2 sequel films, The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. I plan to do the same thing with those films and the alternate versions when they come out, although the comic version of Rise of Skywalker probably won't be arriving for a while on account of the current pandemic in the world and how it's largely halted comic book releases. The film version of this story, of course, is the one that people are most familiar with. According to the package of the case I just showed you, it runs about 136 minutes, and generally, I thought this movie was pretty well paced for the most part. I thought it was just about the right length, not too long, not too short. Tells a pretty full standalone story, but also sets up for sequels. So the movie was very good. It certainly got the job done. I thought the plot was a little too derivative of A New Hope, but that's a pretty minor flaw in the long run. Overall, The Force Awakens, the film, was actually pretty satisfying. But how did these other versions of the story measure up? The novel was written by Alan Dean Foster. Foster is a pretty famous sci-fi author. He's also written a lot of older Star Wars adaptations going all the way back to the series Genesis in the 1970s. He's written a lot of original stories that are unrelated to any other canon media. He's even written works related to the Alien franchise. So in sci-fi, this is a guy who gets around. His novelization of The Force Awakens didn't come out until after the film. This has been a common trend ever since Disney took over the franchise, presumably to avoid spoilers of the film. Foster's novel runs for 18 chapters with 260 pages total. There's also an insert of some screenshots from the film. There haven't been any other novelizations that have done this, to my knowledge, in the new canon. There was also a Barnes & Noble exclusive version which added some extra screenshots as well. Unfortunately, I do not have that version of the novel to show you, although I do have the Barnes & Noble exclusives for the novelizations of the other later Disney canon films, so when I get to those, I'll certainly show those off in said reviews. I did go back and reread this just for the purpose of doing this video, and I've got to say, this is a pretty satisfying novelization. At 260 pages, it's a pretty quick read. I wish the chapters were maybe a little shorter, but they do expand on a lot of things that are in the book. Namely, you see a lot more of Leia and the Resistance prior to the moment that they appear in the film. It does help flesh things out a little. And even a lot of the existing scenes from the movie they go on a little longer, have a little more information. Some of the script is a little different, and there's some elements here that have presumably been retconned by the later films. For instance, there's a scene of Poe and Rey meeting at the end of the movie. They actually don't end up meeting until the end of The Last Jedi in the films, so annoying little oversight there on the part of the Lucasfilm story group. But with how many retcons have gone on in these sequel trilogy films and the adapted works, I guess that's a minor drop in the bucket. There's a few minor extra scenes here and there. Probably most noteworthy is a scene of Poe Dameron coming to his senses after being thrown from the explosion of the TIE Fighter when they crash back on Jakku. Oddly, a lot of the script is different in this book. The overall idea and basic plot are pretty much exactly the same, but it makes me wonder if Foster's novelization was actually based on an earlier draft of the screenplay before revisions and so forth. That said, this is not a bad novel by any means, and I think any fan of the franchise should read and experience this version of the story once, even if it's not necessarily the definitive treatment of The Force Awakens. The Marvel comic adaptation was written by Chuck Wendig, who also wrote the Aftermath trilogy of Star Wars novels, and I've got to check the information on the artists and coloring crew on this. The artists were Luke Ross and Mark Lamming, and the colorists were Frank Martin and Guru EFX. Well, I don't necessarily know that it was required that they put out a comic book version of this on top of the novel. It is good to see that Marvel is still going all out, doing their thing. This was a 6-issue miniseries, but it was compiled into a single hardbound volume like I just showed you, and then also released in a trade paperback as well. Well, I liked the novelization because it added in a few new scenes and fleshed out some of the existing ones. Unfortunately, the comic is not so lucky. The comic does the opposite. It actually removes scenes. It feels like a very rushed, very truncated version of this story. I mean, it's so rushed. I almost hate to say this, but it's a bad adaptation of the film. It adds almost nothing. I mean, there are a few scenes where there's like, little flashbacks and some minor exposition to explain a few things. It's also the only version of the story that we're looking at here that actually has a scene of Captain Phasma falling into the trash compactor, but things like that, unfortunately, don't make up for the rushed tone. 6 issues simply was not enough to tell this story. If they'd gone and done 7 issues, maybe given a little more breathing room, maybe added in a few of the extras that were added to the novel, this could have been a really good version of the story. But as is, if you haven't already watched the movie, I wonder if you're even going to be able to really follow the story because it's so hurried here. One of the biggest complaints I have about the comic is the meeting on Jakku between Lorsan Tekka and Poe Dameron very early in the movie. It's one of my favorite scenes. You just see these guys interacting, what they think of Leia, and in the comic, when it begins, Lorsan Tekka's already dead. They literally just skip over that entire meeting, even though the opening crawl text is setting up the meeting between those two. There's all kinds of little instances like this throughout the comic, and I just really can't recommend it because it was so rushed, and it simply doesn't do this story justice. Alan Dean Foster's novelization is much better than the comic book, expanding on scenes, adding in a few minor new ones, even giving us a glance at Princess Leia and the Resistance before they appear in the film. There's a lot of little moments like this, and as long as it's not something that was retconned by later stories or films, I definitely appreciate it. This isn't necessarily the biggest, best adaptation of a movie that adds in a lot more, but I do think fans will want to read the novelization at least once. But I still have to say, of these 3 versions, the definitive version is still the film. It's tightly edited, it's not too short, not too long, just the right amount, tells a very full story, and of course you got the brilliant visuals, the practical effects, the John Williams score. J.J. Abrams definitely saved the Star Wars franchise with this movie, and like I said before, I think the story is a little too close to A New Hope, but it doesn't deter too much from my overall enjoyment of the movie, even if there were better things to come. Have you experienced all of these versions of The Force Awakens? What is your favorite version of the story? What's your least favorite? Please share in the comments section below. Let me know what you think. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'm Taylor T. Carlson, and I will see you in my next video.